In the summer of 1943, over the burning skies of Kursk, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves facing something entirely unexpected. German fighter aces, men who had racked up dozens of kills against obsolete Soviet aircraft, were suddenly being outmaneuvered, outclimbed, and shot down by a stubby, brutish-looking fighter that shouldn't have been nearly as dangerous as it was. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109G were supposed to own the Eastern Front. German pilots called it the Jahrbeschlacht, the fighter bomber battle where air superiority was a given, and Soviet fighters were little more than target practice. But this new Soviet fighter changed everything. Built from wood and steel, powered by a howling radial engine, and armed with two enormous cannons, it tore through Luftwaffe formations with a ferocity that shocked even veteran German pilots. One Luftwaffe ace described it as a wooden barrel that fights like a demon. Of all the Soviet fighters that challenged German air supremacy on the Eastern Front, there was just one that could genuinely trade blows with the FW-190 at low altitude, and that aircraft was the Lavochkin La-5. To understand the La-5, we must first understand the desperate situation that gave birth to it. By the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. Operation Barbarossa had obliterated entire air regiments, and thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground or torn apart in the air by experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying superior machines. The backbone of Soviet fighter aviation, the Polikarpov I-16 and early model Yakovlev Yak-1s were hopelessly outclassed. Semyon Lavochkin, a quiet, methodical engineer working at factory number 21 in Gorky, had spent years trying to produce a competitive fighter. His Lag-3, a fighter constructed almost entirely of wood due to shortages of aluminum, had entered service in 1941 with high hopes. It was structurally sound, reasonably well armed, and could be mass-produced without strategic materials. But pilots hated it. The Lag-3 was heavy, sluggish, and underpowered. Soviet airmen bitterly joked that Lag stood for Lakarovany, Garantirovany Grob, varnish guaranteed coffin. Its inline Klimov M-105 engine produced barely 1,050 horsepower, and the aircraft's wooden construction added weight that the engine simply couldn't overcome. In combat, it was a death trap against German Bf-109Fs and the new Focke-Wulf 190. Lavochkin knew his reputation, and quite possibly his life, depended on fixing this problem. Soviet aviation designers who failed to deliver results had a disturbing habit of disappearing into the Gulag system, or worse. But in early 1942, an opportunity presented itself. The Shvetsov M-82 radial engine, originally intended for bombers, had been refined and was now producing a reliable 1,700 horsepower. It was a massive air-cooled 14-cylinder beast, far more powerful than the inline engine choking the Lag-3. The solution seemed obvious: marry the M-82 engine to the Lag-3 airframe. But obvious is not the same as easy. Fitting a bulky radial engine into an airframe designed for a sleek inline engine required enormous modifications. The fuselage had to be widened. The center of gravity shifted. Cooling became a nightmare. Radial engines generate enormous heat, and the cowling design had to balance airflow for cooling without creating excessive drag. Lavochkin and his team worked with manic intensity through the winter of 1941-42. The prototype, designated Lag-5, later simplified to Lag-5, first flew in March 1942. Test pilots reported immediate improvements. The aircraft was faster, climbed better, and handled far more aggressively than the Lag-3. But there were problems. The early cowling design caused overheating. Visibility was poor. The radial engine blocked the pilot's forward view during takeoff and landing. The wing design, inherited from the Lag-3, wasn't optimized for the new power-to-weight ratio. Still, the Soviet Union didn't have the luxury of perfectionism. The Luftwaffe was hammering Soviet airfields daily. Stalingrad was turning into a meat grinder. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, needed fighters that could survive combat, and they needed them now. In June 1942, the La-5 was rushed into production. Factory number 21 in Gorky began churning out the new fighter alongside the remaining Lag-3s. By September, frontline units were receiving their first examples. Soviet pilots were skeptical. After all, this was just the hated Lag-3 with a bigger engine, wasn't it? They were about to discover just how wrong that assumption was. The La-5 entered combat in August 1942 during the brutal fighting around Stalingrad. Initial results were Mixed. Early production La-5 suffered from quality control issues, engines failed, cowlings cracked from heat stress, some aircraft lost power suddenly during combat. Soviet industry evacuated east under chaotic conditions, was struggling to maintain standards while producing aircraft at breakneck speed. But even with these teething problems, pilots began noticing something remarkable. When the La-5 worked, it was a match for anything the Luftwaffe could field at low and medium altitudes. German pilots had grown accustomed to Soviet fighters being easy prey below 4,000 meters. The La-5 shattered that assumption. Its powerful radial engine gave it an excellent climb rate and surprising acceleration. In a turning fight below 3,000 meters, it could stay with or even outturn a Bf-109G. Lieutenant Ivan Kozhedub, who would become the top Soviet ace of the war with 64 confirmed kills, flew the La-5 extensively. He later wrote, "The La-5 was not a sophisticated aircraft. It was brutally simple, but in the hands of a pilot who understood its strength, it was absolutely lethal. The La-5's greatest strength was its role as an energy fighter at low altitude. Unlike the Yak fighters, which relied on agility, the La-5 could muscle its way through engagements, dive, strike, climb away, use speed and power, don't get drawn into prolonged maneuvering fights." However, combat revealed serious weaknesses. Visibility remained poor. The large radial engine created a massive blind spot directly ahead. Pilots had to weave constantly during taxi and takeoff, and the cockpit was cramped and unsophisticated compared to German fighters. Engine reliability improved, but never fully matched Western standards. And above 5,000 meters, the La-5 was decidedly mediocre. The M-82 engine wasn't optimized for high-altitude performance, and Soviet pilots learned quickly to avoid climbing contests with Bf-109Gs above that threshold. Lavochkin was already working on improvements. By late 1942, a refined version, the La-5F, entered production. The F stood for Forsiravani, meaning boosted. This variant featured improved engine tuning, better cowling for reduced drag, and a cut-down rear fuselage with an all-round vision canopy borrowed from captured German fighters. The difference was dramatic. The La-5F could reach 648 kilometers per hour at low altitude, making it one of the fastest fighters below 3,000 meters on the entire Eastern Front. Climb rate improved to 1,000 meters per minute. Soviet pilots finally had a machine that could dictate the terms of engagement. Then came Kursk. In July 1943, the Battle of Kursk became the largest air battle in history. Thousands of aircraft clashed over the churning tank battles below. The Luftwaffe committed its best units, JG-51, JG-52, JG-54, equipped with the latest Bf-109 G6 and FW-190 A5s. Against them, the VVS fielded massive numbers of La-5s and La-5FNs, the ultimate refined version with fuel injection and further aerodynamic improvements. Soviet tactics had evolved as well. Gone were the rigid formations and predictable attacks of 1941. Soviet fighter regiments now operated in flexible pairs and fours, using hit-and-run tactics that played to the La-5's strengths. Ground-controlled interception became more sophisticated. Soviet pilots were better trained, more experienced, and absolutely determined. German ace Günther Rall, flying with JG-52, later recalled, "By 1943, the sky over Kursk was no longer the easy hunting we had known in 1941. The new Lavochkins were dangerous opponents. They were fast, they hit hard, and the pilots flying them had learned their business." The La-5FN's armament was brutally effective. Two Shvetsov M-82 20mm cannons synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. While this was fewer guns than German fighters carried, the cannons were reliable, hard-hitting, and perfectly adequate for destroying enemy aircraft. Soviet pilots learned to close within 200 meters before firing at that range. A half-second burst could disintegrate a Bf-109's wing. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the La-5 formed the backbone of Soviet fighter aviation alongside the Yak-9. Total production exceeded 10,000 aircraft, with variants serving in every sector of the Eastern Front. Soviet aces racked up impressive scores flying La-5s. Ivan Kozhedub, as mentioned earlier, achieved 64 kills. Vladimir Lavrinenkov claimed 46 victories. Alexei Gorovets shot down 9 German aircraft in a single mission on July 6, 1943, an almost unbelievable feat before being shot down himself. But the La-5 wasn't just about individual heroism. It represented something larger, the industrial and tactical maturation of Soviet air power. By 1944, the VVS had become a professional, competent force capable of contesting airspace against the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The La-5 also served beyond the Eastern Front. Small numbers were supplied to Czechoslovak exile squadrons and Yugoslav partisans. After the war, the type briefly equipped air forces in Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia before being replaced by jets. What's remarkable is that the La-5 achieved all this despite being in many ways a technologically primitive aircraft. It was constructed largely of wood, its systems were simple, almost crude, compared to German or American fighters. Soviet quality control was inconsistent. Many aircraft rolled off the production line with rough finishes, misaligned panels, and barely functioning instruments. And yet it worked. The La-5 wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, but it was effective, and in war, effectiveness is all that matters. By late 1944, the Lavochkin was being phased out in favor of its successor, the Lavochkin, a further refined version with better aerodynamics, lighter weight, and 3 cannons instead of 2. The Lavochkin would serve until the end of the war and beyond, but it was fundamentally an evolution of the Lavochkin's design philosophy. Total production of all Lavochkin variants reached approximately 10,000 aircraft between 1942 and 1944. Thousands were lost in combat, victims of the brutal attrition that characterized air warfare on the Eastern Front. By 1945, most surviving examples were relegated to training units or scrapped. So, what is the La-5's place in history? It's tempting to dismiss it as a stopgap, a crude emergency measure cobbled together from an obsolete airframe and a bomber engine. And to some extent, that's true. The La-5 was never going to win design awards. It wasn't as refined as the Spitfire, as rugged as the Thunderbolt, or as versatile as the Mustang, but dismissing the La-5 would be a profound mistake. This aircraft arrived at the exact moment the Soviet Union needed it most. In 1942, Soviet fighter pilots were flying outdated machines against an enemy with years of combat experience and superior equipment. The La-5 gave them a fighting chance, not dominance, just a chance. And sometimes, in war, that's enough. The La-5 forced the Luftwaffe to take Soviet fighters seriously. German pilots could no longer assume air superiority below 4,000 meters. They had to respect the La-5's speed, its hitting power, and the determination of the men flying it. More importantly, the La-5 represented a turning point in Soviet industrial capability. Lavochkin's team had taken a flawed design, identified its core weakness, and solved it under unimaginable pressure. They did this while factories were being evacuated, while cities burned, while the outcome of the war hung in the balance. The La-5 wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good by the standards of Western fighters, but it was exactly what it needed to be. A tough, simple, powerful fighter that could be mass-produced and flown by pilots with limited training. It was a weapon designed for the Eastern Front's brutal, unforgiving conditions, and in that environment it excelled. Today, very few La-5 survives. A handful reside in museums across Russia, often incomplete or in poor condition. One airworthy example, an LR-5FN, was painstakingly restored in New Zealand and flies occasionally at airshows. Its distinctive radial engine howl, reminding audiences of a nearly forgotten chapter of aviation history. There's a common myth that Soviet aircraft were universally inferior to their German counterparts, that Soviet pilots won through sheer numbers and sacrifice rather than technology. The La-5 challenges that narrative. Yes, it was simpler than a Bf 109 or FW-190. Yes, it was built from wood and assembled under chaotic conditions. But when flown properly in the right conditions by a competent pilot, the La-5 was every bit as deadly as anything the Luftwaffe could field. Semyon Lavochkin went on to design more fighters, including the excellent La-7 and later jet aircraft. But the La-7 remains his most historically significant achievement, a fighter that arrived when it was needed most and helped turn the tide of the air war over the Eastern Front. In the end, the La-7 embodies a fundamental truth about military aviation. Sophistication and elegance are less important than effectiveness and availability. The Soviet Union didn't need the best fighter in the world. They needed a fighter that could be built in quantity, maintained under field conditions, flown by average pilots, and still achieve results. The Lavochkin La-5 was that fighter. Primitive, perhaps. Unrefined, certainly. But when German pilots looked back over their shoulders and saw that distinctive radial cowling closing in, none of those adjectives mattered anymore. What mattered was survival. And in that contest, the La-5 proved itself a worthy opponent.